Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Rosemary McGee, and I'm honored to be associated with the AJC Decatur Book Festival presented by Emory University. Many thanks to all of you for being here in person or online for our 16th festival, and many thanks to the brilliant and wonderful staff here at the First Baptist Church of Decatur and all the other organizers and volunteers. And now it's time to introduce our first program, sponsored by our friends at Chicory Wealth. That is Maggie Kulik and her many fine associates who enrich our program. Our 2021 theme is Diverse Voices Building Community. Speaking of which, this very special session features two Atlantans who give their voices to the hard work of creating community. If I were to give their full resumes, you'd hear more from me than from them. Suffice it to say, Rose Scott is the voice that provides information, insight, and integrity to all of our loyal listeners every weekday at WABE. We know more about one another and the community because of her. And now, today, we get a closer look at Rose. Albeit socially distanced. And what could be better than that? Well, there's an answer to that question. It's to witness her in conversation with our own Carol Anderson. Woo! She too is part of our community, and she speaks to us and for us, to the nation and beyond. Scholar, teacher, thinker, and best-selling writer Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory, also the chair of that department. She and Rose will discuss Carol's latest book, The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. Book signing later. These two dynamic, dedicated women bring urgent issues to the forefront, to our attention. I'm honored to turn the program over to them, Professor Carol Anderson and journalist Rose Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. Can y'all hear me? Thank you and good morning. It's always interesting when I'm out in the community because someone always comes up to me and they have some really interesting quip. A couple years ago, a gentleman came up to me and said, "Are you Rose Scott?" I said, "Yes, I am." "I thought you'd be taller." And I was waiting for this real provocative question about politics or education. He's like, basically you're short is what you're saying. But thank you, and I've had many conversations with this woman here, historian, educator, author. I think maybe going on, a decade maybe?
Something close to that, yes.
So when I'm ever asked to be in conversation with Dr. Anderson, it's always a easy and a quick yes. And every conversation, I'm always blown away. She leaves me with some little nugget about our society, about who we are as people. And even though I've had so many conversations, I always try to get a question in there that perhaps I've never asked her before. I think I can do it today, I'm not sure. But we'll talk about it. And in our last conversation, we actually talked about this book. And what I wanted to do was to have Dr. Anderson open up about what the Second Amendment is not and what people tend to get wrong about it. Because that's at the core, too, what this conversation is going to be about. So, Dr. Anderson, first of all, it's a pleasure, as always.
Oh, it is wonderful being here with you, Rose.
And I'm going to have to start charging you for these, because, But let's begin here. What are the biggest misconceptions folks have about the Second Amendment?
Wow. It's like, where do I begin to tell the story of how wrong an amendment can be?
So one of the biggest misconceptions is that it is about the individual right to bear arms, and that is what's bedrock foundational about the Second Amendment. Another component of it is that it is about this incredible militia that fended off the British and fought so hard for American democracy and American independence. And so the militia in the Second Amendment is tied up with the incredible, wonderful founding of this nation in terms of all that is good and right and just. Nothing could be further from the truth.
When we talk about our founding fathers, and often when people talk about amendments in the Constitution, of course it always goes back to the beliefs of our founding fathers and why this nation is the way it is in terms of some basic principles. When you talk about the Second Amendment and then we talk about what it is not, and you tell people, you give that explanation, I'm curious, what's their reaction?
It's almost like a Scooby-Doo moment. Shaggy? What do you mean the Second Amendment's not about right? And so then I have to go into the history, the deep history. And that's the power of real history, is it allows you to know what happened and why it happened. It's not just a chronicling of names and dates. It gets at the tectonic plates of how we got here, what's moving this society.
You're accustomed to writing so many issues where race is at the intersection. For our audience here and our virtual audience as well, why the Second Amendment? What was that moment that you decided, this is what I want to tackle?
It was with the killing of Philando Castile, who was the black man in Minnesota who had been pulled over by the police, and the police officer asked to see his ID. And Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerted the officer that he had a license to carry concealed weapon with him, but he is reaching for his ID. And all the officer had to hear was, "I got a gun." And he started firing. And we all saw the tape. I called it like a snuff film, watching this man die. And then it was the virtual silence of the NRA with the killing of this black man for merely having a gun. Philando Castile wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't brandishing the weapon. He wasn't reaching for the weapon. He wasn't doing any of those things. He merely had a gun. And the NRA, that is like the staunch defender of the Second Amendment, the NRA that called federal officers after Ruby Ridge and after Waco jackbooted government thugs, went virtually silent and said, and after being pushed by African American members in the NRA, said, "Well, we believe that everyone, regardless of race, religion, or sexual orientation, has the right to bear arms." And I was like, the NRA? I mean, you know, because they're about the swag. They're about like running up on you like hardcore. And for them to just give this kind of milquetoast response. And so then journalists started asking, well, don't black people have Second Amendment rights? And I went, ooh, that's a great question. You know, and my career has been in exploring the rights of African Americans, and that's one of the rights that I had not looked into, and that's what led to this book, The Second.
And obviously we know that the Second Amendment, it technically predates the United States in a sense. So here, someone like me saying, okay, well, are you just going to start with examining the Second Amendment? But no, you had to go back further. You're going to examine and research the mindset of our political leaders back then. Where did you begin with your research?
I began in the 1600s. And looking at the role of slavery in the United States and seeing the incredible fear by white colonists of the enslaved, the danger. It was like black equal danger, black equal threat. Black equals we need to be secure against this threat. And so I started looking at all of the laws that were popping up, banning the enslaved from having access to weapons, banning the enslaved from owning a gun, and the creation then of the mechanisms to ensure that that happened, which was the slave patrols and the militia. And the slave patrols had the authority to go into the slave cabins and hunt for contraband, books, writing paper, guns, all of those tools of liberation that they're like, okay, the enslaved cannot have these things. And because there were a series of slave revolts or rumored slave revolts, with each one of them almost you saw a tightening of the laws and a greater sense of the fear. You saw these letters going to the king going, oh, if we hadn't found out about this, they would have had us in blood. I mean, that fear is just palpable. And so I started seeing the deep anti-Blackness that is coursing through in this fear that Black people are a threat and that they must be contained, that whites must be kept safe from Black people. And banning arms was one of the key ways, and creating and sustaining the militia was the other.
So with the creation of the Second Amendment, it didn't technically say Black folk cannot bear arms. However,
oh yeah, we know, because I also write on voting rights, so we know about these technically race-neutral but racially targeted, this race-neutral, racially targeted language. And so one of the things that led to the Second Amendment was the battle over the Constitution. So that James Madison, who was the architect of the Constitution, had written into the Constitution that the federal government would control the militia. And the reason for that is that the militia had just been absolutely unreliable during the War for Independence. Sometimes they show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they're fighting, and then sometimes they're like, I'm not feeling this. And then they would run away. And so George Washington is beside himself. How do you run a war when you cannot count on your troops showing up? And so the militia was really spotty. And so the sense was that you had to have greater control. If there could be federal control over the militia, then the thing would begin to work. Well, when that ratification got down to Virginia, Patrick Henry, who could not stand James Madison from the depths and the breadths and the heights that his soul shall reach, he hated James Madison. And you don't often think about how our founding fathers really didn't like each other. Whoa, hated him. And Patrick Henry and George Mason went after James Madison. And one of the things they went after him on when it was time for ratification of the Constitution was the militia. Mason and Patrick Henry were like, we are going to be left defenseless. You know, if the feds are controlling the militia, then that means that, that the feds, who will have the folks from Massachusetts and from Pennsylvania in there, you can't count on them. If the enslaved rise up against us, we cannot count on them in order to protect us, in order to send the militia down to save us. We will be left defenseless. And they were threatening to scuttle the Constitution unless they got protection. And George Mason then honed in on this powerful central government that Madison had created in the Constitution, that government was too powerful. We needed a Bill of Rights. And in that Bill of Rights, we needed to have the protection from the federal government. But when you think about the Bill of Rights, you think about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment, the right to a speedy and fair trial. the right to a well-regulated militia for the security of the state. That amendment is the bribe to the South so that Patrick Henry, George Mason, and the other anti-federalists would not have push for another constitutional convention that would undermine what they had already created. What Madison was afraid of was going back to the unworkable days of the Articles of Confederation, where you had this weak central government and you had these states acting like they were all on their own with their own currency, setting up their own foreign policy. Eisenhower would look back on this and he said, we were a laughing stock. A global laughing stock. And that is what Madison was afraid of. And he knew that the South was really good at playing hardball. The South, during the Constitutional Convention, had basically said, unless we get 20 additional years of the Atlantic slave trade, we walk. You can have your little United States of America. It won't have us. Unless we get the 3/5 clause, where we can count the enslaved as 3/5 of a human being in order to get additional representation in Congress, we walk. You won't have your little United States of America. And unless we get the fugitive slave clause, we walk. And so the intense negotiations that Madison had to go through in order just to get the Constitution drafted, he knew that the threat of scuttling the Constitution, the threat of having a new constitutional convention, unless they got protection of the militia, he knew it was a real threat, and he was determined. He wanted this United States of America so badly. This is why we see these really racist implements in there, such as the Fugitive Slave Clause, such as the 3/5 clause. And this is why we have the Second Amendment. It is the bribe to the South to maintain the United States of America, and it's done with the lives and the bodies of Black people.
Boy, if folks knew this, they really wouldn't want critical race theory taught, would they? It's kind of ironic, because considering this document, which is at the root of our nation, maybe we shouldn't teach the Constitution at all in school. I don't know. It's interesting. I told y'all she was bad. Let's talk about the South. Let's fast forward a little bit.
We in the South.
In the book, you take the reader through a lot in terms of that period. But I do want to fast forward. Probably, let's go maybe to Reconstruction, after the Civil War. What was the climate of the South as it relates to arms and Black folks, formerly enslaved folks?
After the Civil War, as we know, Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, who was a slave owner from Tennessee, became the president of the United States. And he saw his role as, look, we have now unified, the Civil War is over. This is about reunifying the United States of America. That's what this is about. This wasn't about slavery. This was about unifying the United States of America. And he provided amnesty to the Confederate leaders. So the folks who attacked the United States and killed hundreds of thousands of American citizens gained amnesty. And they then retook their spots in those Southern governments and started crafting these new constitutions. Louisiana's constitution, for instance, says, this has been and will always be a government of white people, for the benefit of white people. And those of African descent can never be citizens of the United States. And those governments crafted what are called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were laws to reinstill slavery by another name. They required labor contracts, annual labor contracts that the enslaved had to sign. If they refused to sign, then they could be arrested, and then they could be put on an auction block for a plantation owner to bid for their services, and then they would have to work off their fee for that plantation owner. It also it required disarmament. Because of the Civil War, black folks had guns. And the black codes were like, if we're going to reinstill slavery by another name, we cannot have black people with guns. And so there was this massive push to strip African Americans of their weapons. It also said that black people could not testify in court against somebody white, and that black folks could not be on juries. So this was a way of stripping citizenship rights. And the carnage that it took, because black folks knew they were free. When you know you're free, you walk like you're free. You talk like you're free. You act like you're free. Well, for white Southerners, this was, you do not know your place. And so there was what law professor Annette Gordon-Reed calls a slow motion genocide happening in the South with the killing of black people. The carnage was just intense. And you had black soldiers from the Union Army who were part of the occupying force. White Southerners started complaining to Andrew Johnson that the violence was because these black soldiers really just are an abomination. They are what are driving our anger. If you remove the black soldiers, we'll have peace in the South. Yes. And we're in church, I'm like, Lord.
I'm glad you used that word. We are in church.
Right.
Black folks good enough to use weapons in the Civil War, but then afterwards weren't. It's Cliff Notes version.
Exactly. But this would be one of the patterns that we would consistently see. We saw it in the Revolutionary War, where there weren't enough white men who were signing up to be in the Continental Army, and so the states had to relent and open up armed military service to black men, and so you had like 5,000 black men serving in the Continental Army, and it was an integrated army. You didn't have black units and white units in the Continental Army. It was an integrated army. You saw the same kind of reluctance with the War of 1812, but then the British are like burning down the White House, and the British are attacking New Orleans, and if they get a hold of the Mississippi, it is Katie bar the door. And this is again where Andrew Jackson brings in, he pleads for this black militia to join the forces to fight against the British. And that black militia, those troops were amazing. And then afterwards it was like, nah, we don't want you. Give us your guns. You're not really citizens. And so you see this consistently. The same with the Civil War.
Let's move then to another pivotal and obviously monumental and changing in our nation a period, which is the Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. And we could talk about that for a whole nother couple hours here.
Yes.
So you have the Civil Rights Movement,
mm-hmm.
and you have different factions here. You have obviously Dr. King and the nonviolent movement. Mm-hmm. You have Malcolm X and Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. A little bit later, you have the Black Panthers. Should we just talk about the Black Panthers for a moment? Because the Black Panthers are really crucial in all of this. Because the Black Panthers are the ones that said, you know what? There is this little thing called the Second Amendment. And when Black Panthers start showing up with their weapons, then we have a whole nother set of optics to consider.
Exactly.
But I'll let you start where you want to start with the Civil Rights Movement and as it relates to the Second Amendment.
Okay. So, as we know, with the Civil Rights Movement, it was about recognizing the citizenship rights of African Americans. Jim Crow had just eviscerated those rights. And so it was about this, what they called the Second Reconstruction. And in this Second Reconstruction, what the civil rights leaders knew was that the image of African Americans, the anti-blackness that coursed through our media productions, that coursed through our cultural productions, were that black folks were violent, that they were criminal, and that they really weren't like us. And so you saw the role of nonviolence was to flip that narrative. And so you begin to think about the imagery that you saw. So where you would see students in their Sunday best at a lunch counter, just being at a lunch counter with their books, and then white guys smoking cigarettes, t-shirts, slick back hair, beating up on them. That imagery began to flip the narrative. Nonviolence was absolutely essential in that. Well, then came the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers, their movement was initially up in California. And they were dealing with the massive police brutality that was raining down on black folks in California. And that despite all of the protest, that there was no response from the government in dealing with this police brutality. And it's well documented. The killings, the beatings, the false arrest, all of that's in there. And there are hearings, and then there was nothing, no accountability. And so the Black Panthers came up and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to provide self-defense for the black community. We are going to police the police. And Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale were the co-founders of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. And Huey was a law student, and so he was studying the law. He knew California code when it came to weapons and open carry. California was an open carry state. He knew, he said, I've got this Second Amendment that says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. And so with the California Code and what he understood as the Second Amendment, they would come up where they saw police arresting somebody, and they would stand there with their guns. They knew what kinds of guns to carry. They knew how to carry them, so they were always within the law. And that ticked the police off, because you've got these black guys in leather, berets, fros, guns. I mean, the whole imagery was just militant, radical, violent. But they were like, we're getting no help in terms of providing safety to our community. And so the Black Panthers were there with those guns. The Oakland police ran to Don Mulford, who was a conservative in the California Assembly, and said, we need help. Because every time we stop the Panthers, we can't get them on anything, because everything they're doing is legal. The guns that they're carrying are legal. How they're carrying the guns, legal. We need to make the Panthers' tactics illegal. And Mulford's like, no problem. I find them to be problematic as well. And so with the help of a representative from the NRA, they began drafting the Mulford Act that would ban the open carrying of weapons to make what the Panthers were doing illegal. Governor Ronald Reagan of California was eager to sign the bill. He told Mulford, basically, I'm waiting for this bill. The moment that it hits my desk, I'm signing it. And so you have this really weird configuration when you think about where we are right now, where you have a conservative legislator, you have the NRA, and you have a Republican governor eagerly pushing for gun control legislation. And they were eagerly pushing for it. So Mulford said, no, race has nothing to do with this. Absolutely not. But when you look at the letters, it is all riddled with, we've got to stop the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are a threat. The Black Panthers, the Black Panthers, the Black Panthers. This was targeted at the Black Panthers. Now you notice in all of this, you're not seeing legislation that deals with the root cause, which was the police brutality raining down on the Black community with no accountability. You don't see any movement in that area. Instead, you see movement to create the Black Panthers as illegal.
Y'all see the trend? I am curious though, Dr. Anderson, you mentioned California. Did other states follow after that as well?
Yeah, so one of the things you also see happening in this time is, so remember the 60s. I was just a little wee thing in the 60s. Is that you had the riots in Watts, the riots in Newark, the riots in Cleveland, the riots in Detroit, and you had assassinations. So the Kennedy assassinations, King's assassination, Medgar Evers assassination. You're having these assassinations, you're having the riots, and it led to the 1968 Gun Control Act. And so it's a federal law, and what that did was it created categories of people who could not have weapons, and it also said that a certain type of gun, the Saturday Night Special, which was a cheap gun, was illegal, that you could not have the Saturday Night Special. And what one advocate said was, this isn't a gun control law, this is a Negro control law.
And this is under President Johnson.
This is under President Johnson.
What does your book tell the reader about, was he conflicted at all with this federal legislation?
No.
Okay. Just checking. Just checking.
No. And this is one of the things that I really want to lay out here, is that the power of anti-Blackness that we're seeing from the 1600s, we're seeing the same rhymes and the same rhythms coming through from the Stono Rebellion to Gabriel's Rebellion, to the Battle of Christiana in 1851, to Elaine, Arkansas in 1919, Lord. And all the way through, we're seeing the same kind of fear of Blackness, of Black people asserting their independence, Black people asserting their freedom, and it consistently being defined as Black as threat, Black as dangerous, Black as criminal.
And I want to go back to that 1968 legislation, because it also, this is where we get into, if you are a convicted felon, and all these different populations are now going to be banned from owning a firearm.
Right, and begin to think about how you get the confluence of policy. So when you have the criminalization of Blackness, where you have the hyper-policing of Black communities, that therefore means that Black people are going to be incarcerated more, they're going to be arrested more, they're going to be sentenced longer. That when you have that criminalization of Blackness, and then what you do is you say that there are certain categories of folks who cannot have arms. It's the same thing we do with voting, with felony disfranchisement. There are folks, when you set up a policy that looks race neutral, but it is targeted, racially targeted, it's able to be corrosive to the other rights that American citizens should have.
I think is it 2008? Is it Heller?
The Heller decision.
Yeah.
Now
we flip back to the other side in a sense.
Right. So what we have in the U.S. Supreme Court is the 2008 Heller decision, and then the 2010 McDonald decision. Heller was in Washington, D.C., so that dealt with federal law. And McDonald was in Chicago, so that then meant that that decision would be applicable across the United States. And those cities had really strict gun control laws because there was mass violence happening in Washington, D.C. and in Chicago. And so they thought, okay, the way that we deal with this is through gun control. And you had then a pushback saying this violates our Second Amendment rights. And the U.S. Supreme Court, the originalist in the U.S. Supreme Court, said they went back to look at the history of the Second Amendment and how it came to be and what it was supposed to do. And what they saw in there was an individual right to bear arms. This was the first time that an individual right to bear arms became constitutionally protected in 2008. And this was part of the incredible groundwork that the NRA had done in shaping the narrative of gun rights in the United States. And from there, then you get, particularly in Chicago, what you see happening is that as its gun control law is struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, Chicago is flooded with guns, particularly cheap guns coming in from Indiana. And so when you hear, it is so pernicious. So when you hear, well, you know, after George Floyd, well, you know, if you really cared about it, what about Chicago? As this kind of way to signal that you've got black folks killing black folk, black teenagers killing black teenagers, young black folk killing young black folk in Chicago. And Chicago had tried to handle that, but its methods got struck down by the courts. And so one of the things I make clear in the book is that this isn't a pro-gun or an anti-gun book. This is a book about black people's rights to citizenship, to their full citizenship, and how anti-blackness undermines that access to full citizenship rights.
Now, just so y'all know I'm not making it up, read question number 8 right there.
Let's talk about what this book is not. It's not a pro-gun or an anti-gun book.
She is so good. How often did you get that?
Huh?
How often do people ask you about that? Well, this is an anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment book?
Well, you know, and I do get that. I have been on panels with advocates of the NRA.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was that like? We have enough time?
I lost my poker face at 31, so, you know, it's all captured there. We come at it in very different ways because my core issue is the rights of African Americans to live fully into their humanity. And their issue is basically unfettered access to guns. And so I did an op-ed in The Guardian where I argued that we are dealing with these twin pandemics of anti-blackness and mass shootings. And to understand why we're not able to really wrestle and handle mass shootings, we have to understand the role of anti-blackness. And there's an author, Jonathan Metzl, who wrote Dying of Whiteness. Great book. And one of the things he talks about, for instance, is how he was in Missouri and he was at a help group, a self-help group for those family members who had had someone die from gun violence. And in talking with them, he would talk with them about gun safety legislation. And they were absolutely adamant. They were like, absolutely not. We will be left defenseless. You've got this gun control, gun safety laws. We will be left defenseless. And those folks from St. Louis will come down here and try to take everything that we have.
You know it's my hometown, right?
Right. And so you think about the McCloskeys. Remember that couple in St. Louis during the Black Lives Matter protests? The couple that came out with their guns pointing it at the nonviolent protesters? Mm-hmm. Those folks will come down here and take everything that we have. And so what we have is this fear of being left defenseless. And so we have made this decision that we're willing to accept vulnerability at the grocery store. vulnerability in our schools, vulnerability where we work, vulnerability in our churches, vulnerability in all of our public spaces, just because we're afraid of being left defenseless against the black hordes, these black criminals who will come and try to take our stuff. Anti-blackness does damage to American society.
Who should read this book? Who should read this book?
Oh, I want everyone to read this book. Everyone. I think one of the reasons I want everyone to read this book is because of the moment we're in right now, where we're seeing this massive backlash against the 1619 Project, against critical race theory, where you're seeing these astroturfed school board meetings where folks are hollering about, we want education, not indoctrination. And one of the things about critical race theory is that it is a theory that is taught only in some law schools. So if your kindergartner is learning critical race theory, your baby belongs in Mensa.
Or they may work at NPR in the future. I don't know. That's interesting that you mentioned kindergarten. I got kicked out of kindergarten.
I'm not surprised.
Wait. Because I challenged Sister Vincent. She's no longer with us, but I challenged Sister Vincent about the Pilgrims. And they give you a little Thanksgiving, and I colored my pilgrims like black. She said my name is Rosetta. She said, Rosetta, there were no black pilgrims. And I said, well, how do you know? And that is my journey into critical race theory, and told my father, perhaps we should put her in public school. And I came back for high school, but anyway. Dr. Carol Anderson, again, every time I speak with you, it's a little nugget that I take away. And I know we've had many conversations, and I wish we could take questions from the audience, but we can't. That was not my call, because I love hearing from the community. But I do want to ask this. I think if there was a community question, it probably would be, why do you do this work?
I do this work because of my parents. I think about how my mother had to leave Oklahoma because she wanted to get an education, and they didn't have high school for black children where she was. So she went to go live with her aunt in Kansas City so she could get a high school education. I think about my father, who was a career military man, 20 years, and World War II and Korea, and the mess he had to deal with in the Army. And then coming to Columbus, Ohio, because he wanted my brother, who's on the front row, he wanted my brother to go to the Ohio State University. And when they were looking for houses, my mother found a house on Oakland Park that she loved. And the realtor said, oh no, that's not where you people live. And so we ended up living in an area called Linden. And it was watching my father fight for Linden as the city abandoned that neighborhood. He's on the phone going, when are you coming to pick up the trash? When are you cutting the grass on the city lot? It is so high, rats are running through it. When are you going to do your job? And so seeing how they fought through Jim Crow, how they fought through racial discrimination to try to make this space better for me, my brothers, all of us. that's why I do this work.
The book is called The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. Dr. Carol Anderson, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.